Let's take a look at the Prague Spring, which took place in Czechoslovakia, 1968 to 69. So, the reason Czechoslovakia became a satellite state of the Soviet Union was that in 1948, Stalin had supported a communist coup to overthrow the non-communist government. This meant that effectively Czechoslovakia was being run for the benefit of the Soviets. So that made life in communism hard because it was run by the Soviet Union, and there's secret police everywhere, and like I say, it was being run for the benefit of the Soviet Union. Think of it as being, oppressive. There was no freedom of speech. Purges, as in like getting rid of any dissenters, anybody who disagreed with official party line, were carried out against democratic politicians and people with Western connections. So purges means getting rid of undesirables, effectively. In this case, that means democratic politicians and people who had connections with the West, as non-communists. What this leads to is an event called the Prague Spring, which is brought about due to the fact that there were protests about the low standard of living in Czechoslovakia, and growing resentment to Soviet control had grown in the 50s and 60s. Czechoslovakia had been democratic before the war, or rather before World War II, and since the end of the war, these freedoms had been oppressed since the takeover. So what does the Soviet Union do, or what happens in Czechoslovakia? Well, a new leader arrives, Alexander Dubček, and he announces some reforms. He's going to change communism in Czechoslovakia and try to make it better and try and improve the lives of the people so that they will support communism, is his view. Dubček came to power in early 1968, replacing Antonin Novotny. He was a committed communist, but thought that communism should not make life miserable and people should be free, a little bit like socialism. Effectively, he's talking about communism with a human face. Let's make life better for people, and therefore they will choose to be communist. Therefore, he decides that censorship will be relaxed and criticism of the government will be allowed. Trade unions are given wider powers, and Czechoslovakia was encouraged to trade with the West as they believed this would help increase wealth. People were also given the freedom to travel abroad, and multi-party elections were discussed, as in, democratic elections and other political parties would be allowed, but Dubček did state that it wouldn't happen for many years. As we've discussed, they are the reforms. If you get asked about the reforms, there's your answers to what he wanted to introduce. Dubček became popular with the people in Czechoslovakia. Obviously, he's trying to improve their lives. However, what he does promise, which is different to what happened in Hungary, Dubček says, despite all these reforms, we will not leave the Warsaw Pact, because if you remember going back to Imre Nagy in Hungary, he said they were going to leave the Warsaw Pact, and that's when Khrushchev stepped in. Here we are now, years later, and Dubček tries to learn from this, and he says we won't leave the Warsaw Pact. However, he's going to be met with the same response, except this time it's Brezhnev in charge of the Soviet Union. So what does Brezhnev do? Brezhnev disapproved of the reforms, as he was worried that other Warsaw Pact countries might do the same. As in, if he allows these reforms to happen in Czechoslovakia, then other satellite states will try to do the same. So Brezhnev warns Dubček, do not go too far with these reforms. And then he also orders Warsaw Pact troops to carry out maneuvers on the border of Czechoslovakia. Now, this is clearly an intimidation tactic by Brezhnev to try to force Dubček to reverse some of these reforms. However, he doesn't. So on the 20th of August, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invade Czechoslovakia and were met with very little opposition, as the Czechoslovakian soldiers had been told to stay in their barracks. The Soviet propaganda claimed that these Warsaw Pact troops had arrived as liberators. They did meet a hostile reception from civilians, but no army resistance. Dubček was arrested and replaced in 1969 by a communist named Husak. The point being, they've put him in charge, or the Soviet Union have put him in charge, because he's a puppet they can control. Once again, just like in Hungary, what did America do about this? Nothing, because the policy was containment. As Czechoslovakia was already a satellite state, America and the West did nothing about it. What this leads to, the consequences of this, are the Brezhnev Doctrine. On 26th of September 1968, the Brezhnev Doctrine is set out, which stated, the actions of any communist country affect all communist countries, which means that communist countries would be prevented by force, as in military force, from introducing liberal reforms, liberal as in progressive, as in like the ones we've just seen regarding censorship being relaxed and allowing criticism of the government. The Eastern Bloc was effectively being told to behave, do as you are told by Russia, by the Soviet Union. This made Brezhnev appear aggressive. Dubček was arrested and ordered to reverse his reforms, but was dismissed anyway in 1969, who was a loyal hardliner who immediately ordered a clampdown and arrested over 1,000 Czechoslovakians. So what you see here, the consequence of this Prague Spring, is that Brezhnev crushes the reforms, introduces a politician that they can control, a puppet they can control, to tighten the Soviet Union's grip on Czechoslovakia. What does this do for relations between America and Czechoslovakia? Sorry, what does this do for relations between the Soviet Union and America? The relations become more strained. Many communist countries did not like what Russia had done, and the satellite states were shown Brezhnev's brutality. Even though they don't like what he's done, there's nothing they can do about it. The USA, once again, were shown to take no direct action. And then here you get this example. In 1945, the Soviet Union arrived in Czechoslovakia as liberators, freeing them from Nazi rule. And here they are in 1968, rolling their tanks in as oppressors of the Czechoslovakian people.